Hi, this is Mrs. Brown, and I am here to talk about stem changing verbs. I know some people are having some struggles through this, so hopefully by the end of this recording you'll understand stem changing verbs a little bit better. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to remember our regular verbs. So there are three different kinds of verbs in Spanish, and they are verbs that end in AR, ER, and IR. Also, verbs are called infinitives, and they can be divided into two parts. So we're going to have the stem and the ending. So if we take our first verb, hablar, and we break him apart, the stem is going to be HABL, and the ending is going to be AR. The same with comer and vivir. So every verb or infinitive can be broken into two parts. We have the stem of the verb and the ending, and some stems are longer than others and some are very short. Okay, so let's look at conjugating these verbs. Remember, we have AR verb endings, ER verb endings, and IR verb endings. And we really need to memorize these because that's how we speak, that's how we read, that's how we know who is doing which action. So, again, what you're going to do when you're conjugating the verb and you're changing that verb to say who's doing the speaking, you're going to write the stem of the verb, and then you're going to go in and put that ending. So you could actually write the stem of the verb, which is everything except for the AR, underline the AR up here, and write it in each section, and then go back and fill in with the AR verb endings. Okay, so you always want to check the end of the verb to see what kind of endings that verb's going to take. So hablar is our infinitive, and that actually means to speak or to talk. But because we've changed it in the box, hablo is now going to mean I speak or I talk. Hablas, you speak, you talk. Habla, he, she speaks or you speak. Hablamos, we speak. Habláis, you all speak if we were in Spain. And hablan, they speak or you all speak. The same thing with comer, to eat. You could take off that ER ending, put COM, which becomes our stem, in each of the 6 boxes, and then make sure that you put the ER verb endings on the end to tell us who is actually doing the eating. And then again, the same thing with vivir. So lots of repetition, lots of doing the same thing. Knowing what the stem is, knowing what the verb endings are, and then attaching them together. So hopefully you kind of understand that and know that if you're saying I live and you write vivir in the blank, excuse me, let me go back, you should know that that would be incorrect because you'd be saying to live instead of saying vivo, I live. Okay, so that's why it's wrong to put the infinitive or the verb form in a sentence or in a blank, because it's not saying who's doing the action. So always conjugate your verbs. So how are stem changing verbs different? Well, stem changing verbs have one more step that's involved. Remember that the verbs or the infinitives can be divided into two parts like we just talked about. We have the stem and the ending, and we're going to look at 3 different verbs because these would be categorized as stem changing verbs, and we're going to look at the AR verb, ER, and IR verb again. So we'll look at cerrar, volver, and pedir. So again, they have one more step, and their stem changes also, but only in some forms. So that means looking at the stem, there's going to be an extra step involved that we have to do for stem changing verbs. And that's why they're called stem changing verbs, because their stem changes. So what does that mean to me? So if you look again, we're going to take our example here of cerrar, divide it into the two sections again. So we see that CERR is the stem and AR is the ending. So you can do that with all of our verbs. Now, a lot of times next to the stem changing verbs, you're going to see that there are some extra letters in parentheses. So this tells me that this is an E to IE verb, which means this E in the verb is going to change to an IE when I change it. And when you look down here at the bottom, below that, you can see that that is changing. So we see that there's an IE instead of just an E in some of the changes, not all of them, but some of them. Okay, if you see an O to UE, that means that O in the word is going to change to a UE. And then on pedir, it's E to I, and you see that E is going to change to an I. And if you look down at the bottom, the E changes to I in some of the forms. Now notice that this is part of the stem. This is not the ending, okay? Because we're going to have to go back and add our endings to tell us who's doing the action. So we like to call these boot verbs, because now if you see why, our boot comes up and you can see where the stem changes are. The stem changes only take place inside the boot. So maybe, hopefully, that makes more sense to you now. It kind of gives you a visual. If you're not sure, okay, I don't remember, which words stem change and which ones don't, remember that it's only the ones that would fit inside a boot. Okay, so hopefully that makes more sense now. Okay, so other common stem changing verbs. Kind of give you a few minutes to look at this. There are lots and lots of stem changing verbs out there, and I noticed that in our curriculum sometimes you're given verbs and you're not told if they're stem changers or not. So as soon as you find out that one might be a stem change, go ahead and write how it changes next to the word. Okay, so again, we have some examples. We have O to UE. Also, if you have verbs, some verbs are U to UE. We have E to IE, and we have E to I. So you want to make sure that you are doing this right so you don't get counted off for spelling and not knowing which words change. Now, some of our words, like if you look down here, tener and venir, we learned tango and bango. Those are not going to have a stem change, as you see here in the word, in the yo form, but it'll have a stem change in the rest of the boot. So sometimes I like to refer to those as low top boot verbs because they don't go all the way to the top, to the yo form. Okay, odds and ends. Some verbs, they're still stem changing, but they look a little bit different. So, like for example, this would be an I to IE verb. This is, normally we have E to IE, so that's not common to have an I to IE, so he's just kind of an oddball. So we'll put the boot around him, and you can see where the change is going to be. Jugar. We've practiced him before. He's a U to UE verb. And then oler means to smell, and that one's really different. That one is going to have an H in front of the stem change because Spanish doesn't like to start a word with a stem change, so it wouldn't make sense to just start it with an O, or a U. So you have to have a consonant in front of that stem change. So that's why it goes from an O to an HUE. So really this is an O to a UE verb, but you have to have an H in front because it's not going to start a word with a stem change. Okay, other irregular verbs. Some of these have irregular yo forms and also a stem change. Okay, now these are some of these words, and they're in our lesson this week, like salgo. We kind of call those go verbs because they end in go. But then they conjugate normal, like they would just take the regular IR verb endings. Okay, so you would go back to the stem. There's no G in the verb, so you would just write SAL in the rest of the conjugations, and then you would add your IR verb endings. So make sure that when you're conjugating these verbs, you don't go to the yo form to create your new stem. You have to go back to the original form. Okay, I don't want you to get confused and start putting a G in all of the forms, so be careful about that. Okay, so if you look here on the right side, there's a lot of verbs that have irregular yo forms, like veo, that has an extra letter in there. Doi has the Y. Parecer goes to parezco with the Z in there. But then in the rest of the conjugations, they're just going to be normal. So you'd go back and for the stem, like dar, you would take off just the D, that would be your stem, and you would put AS, since that would be the to form, that would be the next one down. Now, tener and venir and decir all say that they're stem changers also. So these three on the bottom have an irregular yo form, and then they also stem change. So you need to think about them also being a boot verb. So how do I learn them? There are no tricks to know which verbs change which ways. So the best way to learn them is to keep your notes nearby and to refer to them frequently. You want to keep looking at those, especially if you have a doubt or you're unsure. And the more you do this, the more you'll begin to memorize them over time. And it just takes lots of repetition and frequently going over those verbs, and you'll eventually not have to look at your notes so much, and you'll understand, and you'll be able to memorize them and know which ones stem change and which ones don't. So anyway, I hope this helped you a little bit more to understand what a stem changing verb is, and thanks for listening.